are quite pliable. You'll find if you take them out of big trees, they have enormous stems at the bottom, which you might use for decorative things. But mostly for fences and structures, we use the finer part. And be careful you don't kill yourself, because they often go out dead trees, and you might pull the tree down on top of yourself. So I always worry that people are going to go pull trees down. But they're around,
true, yeah,
and if you find them in one place, you'll probably find lots. But they're about here too. So those are grapevines. Then there's stuff like Virginia creeper and Boston ivy, which you can also use. It's not as good. It's softer, but anything that works, I say. People say, can I use whatever? Of course you can use it. It's just a question of how good it is, or how easy it is to get, or how pliable it is, and how easy. So you can find anything. And once you find a source, like a source of wild willow, it's renewable. You can go back every year and get some more. And the same with grapevines. You know, there's your little stuff growing. You're not killing it by cutting it down. You're just doing a pruning job, and it'll all be back next year, maybe bigger and better than before. So those are those sorts of materials. And we use, those are most sort of materials we use for anybody got any cream interrupti. Then there's bark, which we don't use a lot, but we can. And bark is very useful because it's easily gathered in the spring. Cedar bark is very useful because, well, I go to where they make cedar posts, and they just have the cedar posts cut and taken into the cedar yard. And if you go in before they put them through the big machine to take the bark off, you can just pull the bark off. And again, you're using something that's going to be destroyed anyway, or it's going to be made into mulch. So it's a very good idea to find somewhere that's doing cedar posts. The only thing is that after about July, the sap stops coming up and the bark won't lift very easily off the tree. But this year, of course, it's so wet, it'll probably go on being very easy for ages. Depends so much on what's happening up here, and we're dry. But it's no good. People say, oh, I've got lots of old cedar logs, I'll come and get some. Well, if it's been there for a year, you won't be able to get it off. So it's got to come off when it's either fresh or just recently cut. So, you know, you can use anything, basically.
Ankaret, that's true for everything we're talking about. It's good to use the fresh,
yes,
right?
Right.
If we have a grapevine that we've cut last year, it's not going to be
up. I
viable.
know. You can soak things up, and particularly hard things like willows and grapevines. If you have a pond, you just pop them in there. If the willow, for instance, has bark on, and we're going to be using willow today too, that takes a long time for the water to penetrate the bark and get to the middle. So it depends a little bit on the humidity too. In Calgary, they have to soak it for 2 weeks. Here, usually a week's enough. But it depends on the humidity as to how dry the piece of willow is. But willow has to be soaked, or willow can be used fresh. And you can use it, you'll find again with willow in the spring, it's new growth is too new. The best time to collect willow is in the fall. Ideally when the leaves are off, but you don't have to do anything then, but otherwise you have to peel off the willows. Most things are seasonal. Of course, when you get to things like rushes and cattails, they are only good. A rush and a cattail grows up in every spring and gets to its best by the end of July, and then it starts to deteriorate. So August is the best time to collect those sorts of rushes and cattails, which we don't use a lot for fencing. We can, but it's used more for other things, but it's very available, it's everywhere. And of course, it's regenerative too. So you're not killing anything by taking it off. So others, what have we got in the thing of others now? Well, we talked about barks. What haven't we talked about here? I think most of these things, this also applies to basketry, of course, too. Storing stuff, if you collect cedar bark, for instance, it's much easier if you roll it up. If you keep things in long, straight things, it's much more difficult to soak them up. You know, if you want to go and get some cedar bark and it's fresh, you can either take the outer bark off immediately, but roll it up, because if you come home with pieces this long and then you want to use it, you know, it's a bit difficult to find anywhere to soak it up. So it's a good idea to roll things up when you collect them. Same with grapevine. If you weren't going to soak it later, you know, it's easier to have it organised. And then we'll talk about willow too, but we can look at the willow and I've got down there. Any questions about materials? Anybody got anything I mean, anything goes, I feel. But sometimes it's nice to get some ideas, just so that you can keep an eye out in your garden. And of course, if you're pruning dogwood or any of those things, that's the obvious way, is to collect your prunings if you've got a garden, or if other people are pruning. Because nobody minds giving them away. It's not something they keep usually.
Roadside ditches are also good because you have only 1 year growth if they cut.
Yeah. Or out west, or if you buy a railway line, they're wonderful for willows because they cut the willows beside the railway line, and then the next year it comes up as first year willows. So you get used to it. And as I say, when you're used to collecting, you find your haunts, because your haunts come back every year. You're not destroying them, you're just borrowing, taking. So, any other questions about materials?
You said the cattails. When to pick those? July?
Well, usually about the end of July. You want to get them when they're at their best.
Yes.
And before they start to dry off at the top. And you'll notice, now this year of course it's very wet, but cattails grow more in ditches and things.
Yes.
And so they do get dried up.
Yeah.
And usually by the end of July, beginning of August, quite often the ditches are dry, so that they're getting a bit dried up. Anything like grasses or cattails, you want to get them when they're at their best.
Yeah.
Because then they start to deteriorate. And then when they start to deteriorate, they're not as good as they were before they deteriorated. It makes sense, really. But it doesn't always work that way, because sometimes, you don't get them, or you forget about it, or you wait. You can go on getting rushes until the fall, but they get black spots on them and they deteriorate. They're not as good.
Black spots. Yeah.
Well,
But you don't want them green. You want them.
Oh yes, you collect them. When you collect
collect them
anything
green.
like cattails or rushes, you want to take a big bath towel or a piece of plastic, because if you bend a fresh rush, it has a crack, and then you stick it straight again. But when you start using it for a chair or anything, it breaks where it cracked. So if you go collecting anything green, keep it straight.
Keep it flat.
Don't let it bend.
Yeah. Okay.
And you just have to remember that when you go to wherever you collect them. Take something with you, lie them out, roll them up in whatever it is, take them home rolled out, and then you dry them out in the sun. And then once they're dried, or you can put them under your bed, they aren't fussy. They have to be dried out. And then before you use them, you just soak them up the night before. You don't soak them, you wet them, wrap them back up in a towel or something, the old blank sheet or something, and they'll all be nice and moist the next day. You don't need to soak.
Rushes.
Just rough
We call it mellowing. It's rather sweet, really. You mellow. You mellow.
So you just have to wet them and then wrap them up.
Yeah.
To,
Yeah. I just bring them out, put them on a bath towel out here, hose them, turn it off, wrap them up, put them in the shade or put them on some corner, and they're all nice and soft again the next day. If you don't use them, you must let them dry, because otherwise they get very smelly. They don't like being wrapped up.
No.
Wet.
No. So you've got to dry them.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. 'Cause that's what it is, though.
Anyway, I think we're not going to use a lot of those for your fence. You can. There's absolutely no reason. Oh, sorry, did that get blown over? So now we're going to talk about, I thought we'd walk around the garden. I thought